Have you ever wondered what a technology and business reporter at some of the most top tier outlets, such as the Wall Street Journal, looks for in an interview, what they want to see in a pitch, and how they feel about follow ups? Then, my friends, you're not going to want to miss this episode. All right, everyone. I am so excited for today's episode. This one is one that so many people ask me about. And I know that when it comes to small business PR, it's all about making sure that you can get through to the journalists, right? They are the gatekeepers. And I'm so excited that today we have an incredible journalist with so much experience here, actually answering the questions we're dying to ask him. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Suman Bhattacharyya. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So can you tell all the listeners a little bit about where you are now and the places and publications where you've worked and reported for?
So right now I work as an independent journalist. I report about things that are technology related. Some of them involve financial services, some of them not. I also delve into topics around retail and adjacent topics like insurance, and things that, may not be connected to financial services, but that I discover are. I've been branching out more towards broader technology topics, which I find has been really great because it reinforces everything I learned in financial services. So I work across many different publications, from financial trade publications, with examples like Tearsheet, Banking Dive, FinLedger, or broader publications and publications that have different audience reaches, such as the Wall Street Journal or Glossy.
That's awesome. I love that you have such a diverse and wealth of experience. So the first things first, I want to ask you kind of a crazy question is, you get pitches all day, every day. What is the craziest, funniest, or just flat out worst pitch you've ever received? Let's start with that one.
So this is the time when I was a financial technology reporter working for an outlet as a dedicated resource. And I received a pitch that was, to put it diplomatically, relating to sanitary technology. And you try to have some empathy for the person on the other end. They probably have a lot of pitches to send, and I'm sure that it was sent with no ill will in mind, but it was just completely off. And then I've gotten pitches for things that I can't really easily discuss in an on the record podcast. They were just like things that were kind of far outside of the realm of what I write about, and the lesson is that try to always pay attention to what the person writes about and get a sense, is it something that's going to resonate or not? Otherwise, it's just a matter of, they're just not going to pay attention to your pitches.
And what about just some really rookie mistakes, like spelling errors or getting your name wrong? Do you get that a lot?
I've been called Susan before.
So that's a hard no, right? Do you keep reading after that?
I try to, but it's it's kind of oh, well, they can Google my name and they can see it's right. So,
right.
I think that, little things like that, just try to check to make sure that when you're cutting and pasting the pitch from somewhere else, that the person's name that you sent it to last was not in there. One time I remember that it was sent to a fellow named Phil. I actually know who Phil is. So it's okay, I think I know where this messaging ended up. So that's also
so did Phil, this is another question, is maybe Phil is your colleague. Is it okay to pitch to two different people at the same publication?
I think it's okay. I mean, people are busy. Not everybody has the time to respond to every pitch. Sometimes, certainly in my realm, once I've got a lot of projects on the go, sometimes I can be a little bit enmeshed in those, and I can't respond to new inquiries right away. And if it's something urgent that, say, a colleague can pick up, then, more than happy to have them do it. Other times you might want to have a specific journalist cover a topic. Maybe they have a connection to the topic. Maybe they know about that topic. Maybe you have a personal relationship with them that makes you trust them more than somebody you don't know. So if that's the case, then I would say, try to keep the relationship with that person. But if it's something that you need the message out there. I don't think it's bad to send it to more than one journalist on a team. I'm usually not offended by that.
Well, you're probably one of the nicer journalists then. You're kinder maybe, because I know earlier in my career, I've definitely gotten people's names mixed up and gotten their beats mixed up. And people are like, I cover fashion, not tech. And you live and you learn, I'm human like everyone else.
I mean, people are human. They make mistakes. And I don't think that, there's this, I'm not going to go to Twitter and like post it everywhere. I don't think that's right either. But, just try to take the time as much as you can. And, like I'm occasionally guilty of spelling people's names wrong too. It happens. But the important thing is that you just try, because we get so many pitches a day and so many people want to get attention. It does make the extra, taking the extra effort to get the name spelled right is good.
Yeah. So you said that you receive so many pitches a day. Can you give us like a number of like what that range is? Because we have no idea what your inbox looks like. I can imagine, but let's just paint a picture for us.
It depends on the day. I mean, there are some days that I might get 25 new emails. Some days I might get 100 emails.
Oh, wow.
It really depends on the time of the year or the time of day. So sometimes I have to go through a lot of emails I get overnight because some people out on the Pacific Coast are sending me messages overnight, or maybe they're in London too. So I live on the East Coast, so it's a matter of me having to go through those. So it's different batches at different times of the day, but it can be sometimes hundreds of emails a day. So it's really hard to go through all of them and respond to each of them individually, because I just wouldn't have time to do my own work if I responded to every single one. And I hate not responding to emails, but I feel like sometimes you just can't.
Yeah, you're a really nice journalist, because I know a lot of journalists maybe don't care as much because they're just so focused on the story that they want to write about. But the fact that you at least try to respond to everyone, that's really nice of you to say that. And we appreciate that. So you touched on something earlier, which is if you get an email from someone whose name you recognize, right? Maybe it's someone you already have a pre-existing relationship. Would you say that you're like 10 times more likely to actually open that email?
Yes. So like, for instance, if you send me an email, even if it's something completely unrelated, I'm more likely to open it. I won't probably respond 100% of the time. I'll try to, but I'm more likely to interface with you if I know who you are, if I know we've spoken, and we have a relationship.
Yeah. So there's, for my community of small business entrepreneurs, they feel like the bar is so high that it's so hard to reach to get into an editor's inbox or someone like you. They need, like a PR agency vouching for them. But I think for me and my whole mission is it starts with a good story. It starts with a good pitch, right? That is the beginning of building that relationship. So can you tell me, out of all of the information and people out there, what makes a story good? What do you look for in your 100s of emails that you get?
You're not going to like the answer. I mean, it depends. But generally, this is kind of a cliche, the 5 W's: who, what, where, and why, and sometimes how. I feel like you have to be able to answer those questions, and you have to be able to position whatever it is that you're proposing in a bigger context, not just the context of your company, but how does this thing or issue affect a broader number of people? And can you demonstrate that that's true? Maybe you have some numbers to back that up. It always helps to have that. Now, I know that a lot of research is kind of should be taken with a grain of salt, but sometimes you do have numbers to back that up, and you can tell that, hey, I'm not just proposing something that affects me. I'm proposing something that affects a much bigger number of people. And if you can illustrate that to a journalist, I think that helps in kind of getting your foot in the door.
100%. And that's one of the things I say in my CPR method, which stands for credibility, point of view, and relevance. And relevance is the most important thing. So, you probably get pitches for, I don't know, software products, whatever. Can you give an example of like when a pitch is just not relevant and when it is? Is it like if they start off by saying, oh, I built this company, we're really cool, like that tone already is just like not one that's serving the broader audience. Whereas if they say, hey, we did studies on our users and here's the data, like maybe that's something that's more usable.
I think that if it's not a very household name company, you need to rely more on other ways of trying to demonstrate that what you're proposing is in the journalist's wheelhouse and is relevant. If you are more of a household name company, the challenge becomes, well, how is this new? Because I'll give you an example. I recently got a pitch for a new product launch of a company, and I was going to pitch it to the editor. And the editor was like, we already covered that company recently. So is it worth taking all the resources of our team to cover this incremental product launch? Like, that's equivalent to maybe the iPhone 4 to the iPhone 4S, like you need to be able to demonstrate the relevance. And I think how you do that is you look at the stories that this publication has written, you look at the writing style. Maybe it is only an incremental launch, but maybe that's important. Then you need to be able to explain that that's important and not just, oh, we're launching this new thing. Because from a journalist perspective, you have to think that they're going to assume, oh yeah, every company's doing that. So what makes you special?
Yeah, I think that is the number one skill and kind of the mental hurdle that founders have to go through, because they're so focused on their product. It's their baby. So to be able to tie it to something else, like for them, it's obvious it's important, but then for an outsider, it's like, well, it's not really important, right? So what you said about like data or research or something like that, those are some really great tips. Do you have any other great tips in terms of like, if I'm just starting out and I don't know you, right? And I don't have like fancy board members, how else can I make my story? You said relevance is key, maybe some data. Is there something else that I can do to make sure that I am like ready before I send this pitch, so that it's a really good one?
Take a look at the kinds of stories the person writes. Try to structure your pitch around the way they write a story, and try to explain it to them in language that resonates to them. Try to stay away from things like, this is revolutionary, this is democratizing A, B, C, D, E, F, G, like all these buzzwords. Like, they sound great in like these formal pitches, but journalists have heard them so many times, they become so like almost turned off by them, because just try to focus on what it is that's important and why. Why are you writing this story? If you can't answer that question, then you probably shouldn't be writing the story. That's what I used to tell reporters when I was an editor.
But I love the word revolutionary and groundbreaking and democratizing. So now I got to find something else to use.
There's maybe a way of explaining that in a more concrete way that doesn't sound so buzzwordy. There is a tendency, I've worked in several newsrooms where there is a tendency to turn off from buzzwords. I'm not saying that they're not going to read your email. I'm just saying that's another reason why they might be skeptical.
Got it. So if I put in the subject line, new product democratizes fintech with AI, it's like, really?
Well, then I look at that and I go, well, how is that different from all these other pitches? You need to find a way to stand out. This person might be getting hundreds of emails a day, maybe thousands of emails a day for all I know.
Yeah. So being specific helps, right, in the subject line. So maybe it's like it's a certain demographic or certain type of user, as opposed to democratizing the entire industry.
Or maybe the story is about the how. Now, you have to be careful, because a lot of trade publications tend to care a lot about the how. How the sausage gets made is very, very interesting and relevant to trade publication audiences. Consumer publications, maybe not so much, unless it's something that the average consumer is going to be interested in. But if it's something very businessy, if I take that to a general publication, they're going to be like, well, it's not really relevant to our readers. So you need to be really careful about how you're pitching. Publication about how something gets done may be super interesting to a specific type of publication, but others not.
Right. And I say this too, is something I've learned from pitching, is that if you want to pitch to like a TechCrunch or, BuzzFeed or something that has like 30 million people who are reading it, you need to be relevant to 30 million people. And a lot of times it's just not there. And so I actually recommend a lot of founders to pitch to kind of the industry outlets that understand what they're doing first. Do you agree with that? And can you talk a little bit more about like industry trade versus like a top tier, like a Wall Street Journal?
So I think that the industry trades are very interesting for companies that want to connect with media initially. I think that if they've got an interesting story from a business perspective that they can deliver. The challenge though is, as you said, with 30 million readers, how do you demonstrate that it's relevant? For a trade publication, maybe you can really study like who their readers are and try to get a sense, who are their competitors, who are their readers. Do some research on the back end to try to figure out like how to position the pitch. But no, industry trades are a good idea. I think that for a larger publication, it is demonstrating that resonance with a much larger audience. And that can be challenging. That's challenging for journalists pitching them too, because the question you'll always get back from the editor is, how is this relevant to our readership? And another one I've gotten is, there's nothing new here. And that is a common thread with, I think that with a larger publication, that's much more of a yes or no answer than, say, with the trade.
Yeah. So in terms of thinking about that relevance, right, should we be thinking about kind of the effect on society, or maybe women versus men, or mom versus dads, like, our perspectives, our attitude shifts, like larger socioeconomic trends, like things like that?
I think it depends on the type of publication, depends on the type of journalist. Maybe if you're a journalist who writes about societal trends, that's enough of an interesting topic. But if you're in my realm, and I'm a business journalist primarily, it has to be in the realm of, why is it relevant at a specific time? And the currency of the time is important. And also, how does it link to what else has been going on in the industry?
Got it. So maybe is that a big difference between the business news versus consumer news?
Not necessarily, but I think that there are a lot of consumer news topics that are broader in nature, and generally, a lot of the business publications I've written for have been more like, okay, so what's the new wrinkle here, and how does it link to a broader narrative of a topic or evolution of a topic?
Yeah. So you touched upon the things you look for in a good story, but what about specific things in an interview subject? Let's say you have 3 or 4 people who are all qualified to speak on a certain thing. How do you pick the one that you're going to interview?
So sometimes I don't always pick the person I'm going to interview. Sometimes I have to go on LinkedIn and I say, I'd like to speak to person X, and that person's not available, or the PR person hasn't made that person available. So, you go through and you try to find the person that's closest to whatever it is that you're writing about. And sometimes that person is not the CEO or the COO. Sometimes that person is like, maybe they're just a product manager who understands something very granular and is very close to the customers. So I think the lesson there from the source side is, you don't necessarily always have to make the CEO do the interviews. Maybe it's interesting to have the product manager or the customer experience lead, or maybe in certain instances, somebody who works, really down in the trenches to explain and really reinforce the point.
Thank you for that. So let's walk through the journey of the pitch, right? So let's say I send a pitch on something and you respond and you say, okay, this is interesting. What does the process look like usually, like next? Are there different layers of approvals? Would you actually answer yes and then interview someone a month later? What is the turnaround time?
It sort of depends, because if you're working horizontally across media outlets, you sometimes will send the pitch to one editor, and you'll see how they take to the idea. Maybe they have questions about it, and then you'll have to go back. So the amount of time it takes to respond depends on perhaps how newsy the story is. If the story is kind of more broad, but it's still relevant, it's not wrong that it's not necessarily a bad thing that it will take the journalist some time to respond. Maybe they need to get responses from their editors. And, the response timing of editors varies by publication. It varies by what their workload is like. So I think it's very much depending on the situation. But if the pitch is super targeted and those things about why and how are answered, and it's done in a very clear way, I'm in a much better position to say yes or no. It's when things are just kind of like more amorphous and kind of like, I'm not sure, that it takes a longer time. So if a pitch is clear, even if it's not a fit, then I'm much more in a position to be able to say, no, that's not a fit.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, I obviously recommend that the small business founders, like they format their pitch with maybe 3 bullet points. So it's not a ton of text, right? And it's not this like autobiographical thing. Do you have any tips on like what you like to see in a pitch and what is just off-putting to you? What is your biggest pet peeve?
I mean, it's stuff like if it takes a long time to be able to get to the point of what the pitch is about, that's kind of hard because if you're busy, you can't necessarily read to the end. So this sounds kind of basic, but just putting what's really important at the top for me is important. Different reporters probably going to have different preferences. Some reporters don't like pitches. I mean, it depends on each reporter. Personally, I like it short and to the point, and I want to be able to know what the story is about in the first few sentences that I read.
Boom. I love that. It's fight for your attention because you're busy. Another question I got to ask all the time is, I don't have a media kit ready. My website is not super fancy. Can you talk a little bit more about like media kits and all the kind of bells and whistles that people think they need to have?
I don't really use media kits very often. I might consult them if I'm writing about a company and it's crunch time and I'm writing a story and I need to describe the company and I need like basic information about when they were founded and who the founder is and getting the spellings of the names right. But all that information can be provided. So I don't, in my work, have as much use for those. The other question you had was about websites. Well, it is helpful to have a good website. Then I can easily look up information, and it does give the company an extra layer of credibility if they have a good website. But a good website can just be a simple website that is clearly articulating what the company does and looks professional. That's all. I mean, I feel like having these it's the substance that matters to me.
Right. Yeah. Because anyone can go and make a super, amazing website with all the bells and whistles and they don't have much substance to their pitch. What about the fact that they have been featured before or that they've gotten an award? Like, will that help you? Should they put that in the pitch that they have been featured before?
Usually the award thing, depending on the topic, it's not as relevant. It's more like how are they connected to the story and what makes I think there's if you mention an award, you have to like mention why you're mentioning it in a sense. So it's not as relevant as to like, I think I would care more about what the person has done than they've received an award.
Yeah.
But that's just my personal view.
And are you more impressed if in the first sentence or two, they say they've been featured on X, Y, and Z?
Not necessarily. I mean, if they don't have a story for me, then what use is it of telling me that they've been featured in all these other publications?
So good. That gives everybody hope, is that anyone can pitch a good story and you don't need to have a lot of awards or a fancy website or maybe even a fancy PR firm to vouch for you.
I mean, all that stuff about the awards is Googleable. So the journalists can find all that information if you've gotten past the front door.
Yeah.
What's important is that the substance of the pitch is compelling enough for them to want to engage with you.
So we talked a little bit about media kits. You said that's not really a thing anymore. Are there any best days and times to pitch, or does it really not matter?
There's no set time to send a pitch. I do feel like I'll look at my emails in the morning just because I know that there'll be stuff that was sent overnight. So in my case, the morning is always a good time because I know I'm checking. The middle of the day can kind of be a bit of a wash sometimes if you're busy working on various projects. And sometimes I'll look at my emails at the end of the day as well. But the morning is a great time to send new information because I'm always looking to refresh my box in the morning.
Yeah, that's what I say as well. What about follow up, right? Because we all know it's in the follow up. So, what is the right cadence? So many founders that I work with are so scared. They send an email and they say, "Oh, this person's not interested. It's dead in the water." But maybe you didn't even read the email. So, what is the right way to follow up without being a pest?
It's hard. I mean, there's a way to write an email that doesn't sound too aggressive. It's just asking, "Hey, just checking in," and that's fine. But I do get emails from people that sound kind of aggressive and say, um, it's not like, "Why haven't you written me?" But I'd like to draw your attention to something I sent you 2 days ago. I'm not sure if you got like things like that's kind of compel me to respond. And if you're writing a journalist and you're creating some kind of like an obligation for them to respond, and that tone is showing in your follow-up email, that's generally not a good thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I also think following up after 2 days is a bit rushed. Like, give us some days, no?
The only instance I would feel that that would be appropriate would be maybe if it was something that was really fast developing. But
Mm-hmm.
a lot of pitches are not fast developing. So following up in 2 days seems to me like not enough time.
Yeah.
Maybe the person hasn't had a chance to read it. And if they're working with an editor, they haven't had a chance to really discuss it with the editor. And you have to think about pitches sometimes are discussed with editors on a piecemeal basis, but some editors have formal meetings with their reporters where they'll go through pitches. So there's some lead time involved in getting
Yeah.
buy-in on pitches. And, maybe the reporter needs to do more research too. So you always have to keep
Mm-hmm.
that in mind when you're sending a pitch. It's not wrong to send a follow-up email. I just think that you just want to sound as appreciative of the circumstances that they have, and just try to sound as polite as possible.
Yeah, I agree. And that's what I say as well you can follow up, maybe in the next week,
Right.
right? Would that be appropriate?
Yeah, that's fine. Or maybe if you've got an ongoing relationship with them, you'll send an email along the lines of the other things you're sending them. Maybe you're sending them an email about something else, and you might just follow up about it quickly too.
What about using LinkedIn, especially for a business audience? Is it okay for them to connect with you on LinkedIn?
Connecting on LinkedIn sometimes is good, sometimes it's not so good. It just depends on the circumstance. Sometimes it is helpful. I do use it to kind of understand if I need to reach a specific kind of a source. It is a very valuable resource, I find, just to get people who have specific experience. So I think it's a useful tool.
So it's important that whoever's reaching out, that their LinkedIn is optimized because you're going to be looking at it.
Yes, and the LinkedIn
Yeah.
should be, again, the same thing. It should be clear. It should be easy to understand. I would say that's true.
Yeah. What is like a surprisingly good pitch that you receive from someone who's completely unknown, right? And no funding, whatever it is, that actually resulted in a story and it actually really caused like a major impact, not only for their business, but to be able for them to go bigger with their story.
So I can't recall a story where it was somebody that was completely unknown. I do have an example of a communications person who contacted me about a story idea. And it was very clear that they had studied the way I write stories. And they were describing a trend that involved the company that they were pitching. And they were describing it, and they had information to suggest that it was broader than just about that company. And so that prompted me to talk to them and then talk to the company. And then I did all this other research and I talked to other companies, and it ended up being a really interesting feature story to work on. But it all started because the person pitching had kind of studied what I had written and really had the pulse on what I was interested in. And I certainly really appreciated that.
Yeah, let's do your research, right? So I've had cases where I've pitched somebody when I was still pitching for startups, and the journalists didn't run the story. But then because of something happened in the news, 5 months later, they wrote back and said, hey, I need someone to interview. So is it true that you kind of keep things in your inbox? And if you are looking for an expert in that, you kind of go back and do a search and see?
Sometimes that happens, yes. If you have news is breaking about something, and then, yeah, I'll sometimes scan my email to see if there's anybody that would be having that expertise that I could talk to or experience that was relevant. So yeah, I use that as a resource too.
That's awesome. Yeah, because I always say, like, put your name in the hat. You may not get a response right away, but the news is always changing. So you never know when your expertise might be relevant.
That's true.
Is there anything else you want to say to kind of the scrappy entrepreneur who is like, I know what I'm building is really impactful, but I'm just so scared to pitch. I don't feel like I'm ready yet. Like, what do you have to, I mean, you've given us some great tips about relevance and, all the other things. Is there anything else from like a mindset perspective you want to share about like pitching to journalists? Because a lot of people are just scared to pitch to journalists.
I mean, you may want to get a colleague to look at it, get someone to look at it. I mean, I've done that before. Just get another fresh set of eyes to look at your pitch, just to see if you think the questions are answered. I think it's key, like, especially if it's someone you don't know, you're making an assumption on what they're interested in. So it's probably a good idea to test that with somebody else. Somebody you think maybe has a bit of that mindset. Maybe there's a colleague, maybe there's someone else in the industry that you can kind of like cross-check with. I think that might be a good way to like vet the pitch a little bit. Because sometimes I find that the pitches I get, if they just send it to somebody else, that they would maybe have a better go at it.
Yeah. I mean, that's really good to know. So, I mean, vet the pitch, do your research, all of those things. What about needing like someone to refer them to you? Does that help you at all? If you have someone who you wrote a story about and then they're like, hey, I have another person for you. Like, does that impress you much or not really?
Referrals are always interesting because if you've already talked to somebody and you have a relationship with them, and then they in turn refer you to somebody else, then that's always a good way of being introduced because they thought that person would be an appropriate contact for you. So I think that the referral route is good too.
What about with these PR agencies? So obviously there's ones that are really good, and there's ones that are not so good and charging a lot of money, right? And doing all sorts of things. So is there really, like, if someone is employing like a very expensive agency, is that more impressive, or does that not really matter kind of what agency or how much they're paying? Or?
I mean, certainly there are a lot of agencies that are extremely good at what they do. And you can tell by the way that the people they hire and the way that they go about their business. But certainly when it comes to looking at a story, what's really important is the substance. It's not like how it came. I mean, an agency can still pitch you a story that's not relevant, or it says some of the same issues that somebody who's not an agency has too. So, there's no harm in pitching somebody. And even if you don't have an agency, you can still pitch a story.
Yeah, I always say, like, we're all staying at home right now. No one's really going to events. Like, you're the expert, right? So if you cannot access a PR agency, let's just cut that out and you pitch yourself, right? You're saying that you don't necessarily need a PR agency to be able to say, okay, I'm going to read this pitch.
Well, I think what's hard right now, especially since that we're not 100% back to pre-COVID circumstances, is that back in the day, journalists used to meet industry sources at events. Maybe they were just doing meet and greets and talking to people. There was no story expectation, but just like meet and greets with people, just to understand what they do. And then over time, if they develop a relationship with the journalist and there's a topic that kind of springs to relevance, then you might end up quoting that person, but it's a process. And right now it's harder because people aren't meeting in person as much. So, maybe one way would be just it's hard because it's hard to just send an email to somebody and say, I'd like 10 minutes of your time, unless there's a real important reason to want to take their time. So I guess you have to be creative about how to build a relationship. Maybe it's going to a virtual event where you can have one-on-one interaction with the journalist. A really good forum for that is Clubhouse. And you could go to a Clubhouse group, and there are journalists sometimes in those groups, and you can develop a relationship and they will hear you ask your question and try to think about some creative ways you can recreate the physical event circumstance that used to be before the pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, in ways it's there's like pros and cons, right? So what you said is a disadvantage, but in a lot of ways, I feel like for a lot of the newer companies or kind of the solo founders, that they have a chance now because they're not really competing with these other more well-established people for the same rooms. It's just a matter of getting into your inbox, pitching a good story, or maybe getting into your LinkedIn inbox because, they don't need an invite to those fancy events or what have you.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the events that are available are not, there's no like super high wall to get into them. Just participate. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's other ways of getting a journalist's attention than sending an email that's a pitch. And when you combine the pitch with all these other things that you're doing, you're more likely to strike up a relationship if there's a reason to have one, or if the journalist feels like there's a reason to have one. So I feel like, there's other things you do outside of the sending an email that might help build a relationship.
So you said Clubhouse. Is there anything else that they can do to build the relationship right now?
Well, there are other events going on. There are events that are free. There are events that are not expensive, that you can go on and interact with people. You never know who's listening. And what I like about some of those events is they are often very egalitarian with the way that they take questions, like anyone can ask. So
Nice.
I really find that helpful. And I go to some of them just because nowadays I can't go to, well, there aren't a lot of physical events anymore. So
That's good to know that you can go and interact with a journalist and you don't necessarily need to know them or be introduced. And still, if you have a good question, you can still have the opportunity to build that relationship. So we're getting towards the end of the questions, but I do have a question about kind of press releases because you are a business journalist. So press releases are a big thing. I mean, I wrote one, I pitched you a story, and then that ended up being a story. Can you talk to me a little bit more about press releases and how to kind of maximize that? Because I have people who are like, oh, I need to send a press release for every little thing, like you said about iPhone 4 or 4S.
yeah.
So what is a better way to use a press release and then to use that, to build a relationship and to announce something?
And the press releases are just, I find them helpful if they're just like background, but a lot of journalists don't even do press release stories. And some of them, you send them a press release, you're like, oh, you're sending this to 50,000 people. I'm not going to look at it. So I guess the press release, if you're going to write one, it should be adhering to the same principles that I just described about a pitch. It should be clear. It should illustrate the 5 W's. It should say, why it's relevant. It should have all those things in it. But ideally, you want to get to the journalist before you send them the press release. If you just fire a press release off, it's often too late for the journalist to be able to intervene because they might be like, oh, well, this has already been written about. How am I going to demonstrate the justification for doing this story if, a zillion other outlets are covering it?
Yes. And that's what I always say. I say, be strategic. Don't just fire it out without kind of seeing who might be interested in it. So how early? So for example, if they wanted the press release to go live, let's say September 1st, when should they start pitching that before it goes live to a journalist?
I mean, there's some people who say they shouldn't pitch press releases, but if you are going to pitch a press release, generally in the 1 or 2 weeks preceding, it's probably fine. It's always unfortunate to get a press release that's already out there, and then the PR person's like, this is already out there. And sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it's a broad enough topic that you can interview somebody, but sometimes it can be seen as too late almost, because if you're already sending the journalist the news that's out there, the less likely that some of them will cover it because they'll assume that it's not very differentiated or exclusive. So that's the danger of just sending somebody a press release.
Yeah, 100%. That's why I always say be strategic with your press releases. This was such a good, I learned so much as well, and I really enjoyed working with you. I remember back in the day when I used to pitch for fintech, and you were always so nice. And I learned a lot about kind of the process from working with you and taking that story, until it got published. And it was using a press release and it was around an announcement. But, what is for you, what is the most inspiring thing about working as a journalist?
I guess the ability to learn about things all the time, that's really keeps me motivated, and also understanding how different things that are not connected actually are. So just the constant learning is really very, very, very stimulating.
So, this podcast is all about helping people gain the confidence, right, to put themselves out there without needing all the fancy bells and whistles. So can you give us an example of when you were scared to pitch or advocate for yourself, but you did it anyways?
There was a recent pitch I did where I pitched a story idea and the editor had questions. And if I was doubting myself, I wouldn't have responded with information back. So it was a back and forth. It was a bit of a ping pong with the editor, where the editor was like, okay, I get that, but what about this other thing? Have you thought about that? And then I went back and I did research, I did interviews, and then eventually that pitch was accepted. But if I didn't have the confidence to go back and take the feedback and go, okay, well, I'm going to provide the information and just keep persisting, then I would never have been able to get that pitch approved. So I think just continually working on the story idea without getting discouraged by skeptical feedback is worthwhile. So that was one example where I kept on it.
And I imagine this is kind of a top tier publication.
Yeah, it was that was really good, because it was a way of understanding how the editor would look at something, and just getting a sense of what's important in the bigger spirit of them. So, but of course, just having the confidence to continually find the information and correspond. Somebody who would be discouraged would be at the first sight of maybe this is not relevant, they would stop working on it.
Yeah. I'm so glad you went for it. So now with all the news, things are changing. You have so many different things you can cover. What's interesting to you just as a journalist? What are the stories that you're really interested in right now, personally?
That's a tough one, because I read about different topics, but I think for me in financial services, it's always how do you provide financial services to people who are disadvantaged or have barriers to adoption in some way or another. I always find it interesting. And other technology stories, it's basically I'm very interested in how things are done, and how a process evolves. So, how does somebody build something? That's interesting to me. It depends on the topic, but I would say in general, underserved segments of the population, and how the sauce gets made.
I love it. Thank you so much for your time. How can our audience find you and follow you and read and support your stories? Where can they find you online?
I am on LinkedIn and Twitter. I am probably more active on LinkedIn than Twitter, but I use both.
Nice. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. You've given us so much wisdom and actionable tips, especially for the business tech audience. Thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to having you back on the show one day.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity.